Okay, today we're going to look at the early conquest period up to around AD 60, and we're going to be focusing on the second governor, Publius Ostorius Scapula, who was governor of Britain from AD 47 to 52. So, AD 47, Ostorius arrives in Britain. It is also the year of the First Iceni Revolt. Thinking about the background to that revolt, Ostorius arrives to a scene of disarray in Britain. If you want to resist Rome, then actually a good time to do that is when there's this changeover in governors, because you've got this period of disorganisation, really. So what we find is, in these times where we've got these changeovers between governors, the Britons take the opportunity to take this period of weakness and revolt in. So when we look at Ostorius' first actions, then he arrives in Britain to this chaotic scene, and his first actions are to put everything down as severely as he can, and then disarm everyone who he has suspicions about. Now, Tacitus in his Annals tells us that includes the Iceni. Now, the Iceni, we know, were a client state, and so they object to what they see as this insult against them, and revolt against Ostorius. Ostorius puts this revolt down very swiftly. So if we think in terms of his actions and whether they were effective or not, I mean, we can argue that when it comes to kind of military force, Ostorius is very effective. He acts quickly, he's decisive, he's tactical, he uses auxiliary troops a lot in his military responses. But it's also his actions that cause this revolt, and that is something that is important to remember. The First Iceni Revolt, the hill fort that is referred to, or the place where this battle is possibly Stony Camp in Cambridgeshire. We don't have a definitive location for it, but some archaeologists argue that this is a good possible site for the final battle. There is some archaeological evidence of battle. There are human bones which show clear evidence of sword marks, and they were found in ditches during excavations in 1991. An earlier excavation by the British Museum in 1980 suggested that there had been some deliberate destruction of the hill fort, and that probably would have been by the Romans. It's not sure when this occurred. This is the problem. We haven't got any definitive dates. It could have occurred immediately after the Claudian invasion in around 44 AD, or it could have happened at this point. And that's what makes Stony Camp a contender for the scene of the First Iceni Revolt. The area of Britain that Ostorius concentrates on is what we would call now Wales. And we've got several tribes in Wales. Tacitus refers to putting down the Decangi, he calls them. They've got a slightly different name from the one that Tacitus calls them. The other two tribes that cause continuous problems and are names that we need to make sure we remember are the Ordovices and the Silures. And you've got the Ordovices in the north of Wales and the Silures in the south of Wales. The other two tribes aren't as important to remember. So it's the Ordovices and Silures that are the two big tribes in Wales that we need to remember. And this map shows us the early campaigns in Wales. So we know that in the AD 43 invasion and during Plautius's governorship, there weren't any campaigns in Wales. The Romans had not got that far by that point. Remember the Mendip-led pig that dates from AD 49. That is in what would be now kind of north Somerset, the Mendip Hills. So that shows us that the Romans had established control sufficiently to be mining at that point there. But it's from Ostorius's governorship onwards that we are really campaigning in Wales. And you can see from this map here, we've got Ostorius's campaigns marked in blue. Up at the top, that's where he goes into the territory of the Tacangi and then has to go back to sort out the Brigantes. And then down in the south, where he takes on Caraticus, at first in the territory of the Silures. Whilst we've got the map up, we can talk about the later governors as well. You can see that Didius Gallus, 52 to 57, is in green, and Quintus Veranius, 57 to 58, is in pink. Tacitus says that those two governors don't really achieve very much. Certainly in terms of the victories that we have, we don't hear too much about them. And you can also see the campaigns of Suetonius Paulinus, 58 to 60 in grey. Tacitus, again, is in his Annals, talks about particularly the campaign in Anglesey. You can also make out there in red the later campaigns of Julius Frontinus. We're onto the Flavian governors by that point. And then Agricola, we know that he takes down the Ordovices and subdues Anglesey permanently during his governorship, very early on in his governorship. So, in AD 49, the 20th Legion are shifted from Colchester. So remember that Colchester begins life as a military centre. There is a legionary fortress there. But they're moved to Kingsholm near Gloucester. And in their place, a colony of veteran soldiers was set up at Colchester. So AD 49 is an important date for remembering that the colony of Colchester is formed. And this means then, with the 20th Legion occupying Kingsholm, that the Welsh tribes are now hemmed in. And at this point, Caraticus leads the Silures on raids into the Midlands. Tacitus tells us that no severity, no leniency made any difference to the Silures. So it doesn't matter how you treat them, they are going to continue in their resistance against you. So Caraticus. Now we've already come across Caraticus. He's referred to by Dio in his account of the AD 43 invasion. He's one of the two sons of Cunobelinus. And we learn during the AD 43 invasion that Caraticus is defeated, but then he kind of disappears. And now he pops up again. And we learn that he has been involved in leading resistance to the Roman conquest. And I just wanted to focus on this particular part of Tacitus's Annals. It's the account of the final battle between Ostorius and Caraticus. At this point, the leaders of the tribes went round haranguing their men and stiffening their resolve. They allayed their fears, kindled their hopes, and used all the other inducements known to military leaders. Indeed, Caraticus sped round to every part to declare that this was the day, this was the battle which would restore their liberty or make them slaves forever. He invoked the names of their ancestors who had routed the dictator Caesar. It was due to their valour that they now enjoyed freedom from Roman authority and tribute, and their wives and children were unmolested. The men roared their approval when he made these and similar utterances, and they bound themselves, man, by their tribal oaths, not to yield to weapons or wounds. So this is a real sort of, do or die type oath that these guys are taking. This enthusiasm dismayed the Roman commander. Remember, of course, the Roman commander, we're talking about Ostorius here. And at the same time, he was awed by the obstacle of the river, the rampart which had been added behind it, the overhanging hills, the danger that threatened on every side, and the thronging bands of enemy defenders. But his soldiers demanded battle. They shouted that with courage, everything could be taken by storm, and officers of every rank saying the same thing intensified the ardour of the army. I'm just going to pause there for a moment to identify another common trope in Roman history writing. It's the idea of the common soldiers being really kind of geared up for battle and desperate to get stuck in there. And it's something that we come across again and again. I mean, think about, for example, Agricola at the Battle of Mons Graupius. Again, there you have the soldiers being presented as these fearless, brave men who are desperate to get stuck in with their swords. Then Ostorius, after reconnoitring to see where an approach was practical and where not, led his determined army forward and crossed the river without difficulty. When they reached the rampart and were fighting with missiles, the wounds were mainly on our side, and quite a number of men were killed. Note that there are significant losses for the Romans here, although Tacitus doesn't tell us exactly how many. But our men formed a tortoise shell formation and tore down the rough and loosely built wall, and in the hand-to-hand fighting, the armies were evenly matched. Tacitus makes reference here to one of the techniques used by the Roman army, the tortoise shell or testudo formation. This is where a group of men take their shields, and between them they protect their hull, both kind of on top and at the sides. So you are reliant on the men you're fighting with to ensure that you are all protected. And these kind of formations and ways in which the Roman army fought were a product of their professionalism and their training. So these were professional soldiers who were extensively drilled in how to fight in this way. And this is one reason why, in pitched battle particularly, the Britons cannot beat the Romans, because they're dealing with a highly trained fighting force. If we were thinking about this passage then as a source utility question, we might have a title something along the lines of, how useful is this passage in telling us about the effectiveness of Caratacus' resistance to the Roman invasion of Britain? And, well, it tells us lots of information, actually. It tells us about the activity of Caratacus and the British leaders, their positive encouragements. They harangue their men, the stimulants, which could be seen as signs of optimism, or you might actually read them as desperation. I mentioned the do or die exhortation that Caratacus gives the men. I mean, sometimes that sort of heroism is in the face of extreme danger and, certain death. You've got the example cited of Caesar, who has been defeated by their ancestors, so that's used as a morale booster. The response of the Britons, this oath that they take, and the reaction of the Roman commander, being very perturbed by this sight. So they're all things that tell us about the effectiveness of Caratacus as a leader and the effectiveness of his resistance. We've also got the choice of location for this battle. Now that's dictated by the Britons. And it seems like it's a very sensible place for Caratacus to have chosen, if you look at the description of how it's defended. You've got these, ferocious crowds of defenders there ready to fight the Romans. But there is also this careful preparation of Ostorius Scapula. He looks at the points of weakness. He works out the best technique to take before the Romans launch into battle. And although we've got the initial victory for the Britons, the testudo tactic was negative or irresistible. The Britons cannot resist it, so they're driven off by the training of the Roman army. Here's an example of an exemplar response to that question. This passage is very useful in telling us about the effectiveness of Caratacus' resistance to the Romans. The first paragraph shows us how Caratacus and the other leaders go around their men, stiffening their resolve and kindled hopes. This shows that Caratacus and the other leaders are able to rouse their men effectively for war, even against such a strong enemy. The very fact that the men roared their approval indicates the success of such tactics. The second paragraph shows the skill of Caratacus, as he was able to pick a battlefield that was greatly advantageous for the Britons. Ostorius was dismayed by the Britons' reaction, awed by the river, and feared the danger that threatened on every side. This shows that Caratacus clearly had great military skill and led effective resistance. The last line states that the armies were evenly matched. which suggests that the Britons were real competition and threat for the Romans. However, at the end of the paragraph and the majority of the third, it appears that the Roman army is undaunted by such factors and demanded battle. The fact that they crossed the river without difficulty highlights the strength of the Roman army. Also, Ostorius shows his good leadership by reconnoitring to see where an approach was practicable. This again shows how, despite the difficulties, the Romans were stifling a keen fighting force with the ability to defeat the Britons. Therefore, we can see that Caractacus led a very effective resistance, but that the Roman army was a match for it. Now, one thing we do need to think about here, of course, is in the source utility question, we do need to make sure that we have addressed reliability. So with Tacitus Annals, we're thinking about him being a highly respected historian. We're thinking about the amount of work that went into researching his annals, and it's his last work. It's a very mature work. But of course, there is the idea that, I've talked about the trope of the over-enthusiastic Roman army. We mustn't forget that, history is a form of rhetoric for the Roman historians. And of course, Tacitus himself, like most Romans, was never actually in Britain. So looking at this period overall then and what happens in it, well, in 51 AD, we know that Caractacus is driven into the Ordovici's territories, and we know that he is actually defeated in this battle. The exact location of it is unknown. He flees to Brigantia and seeks protection from Cartimandua. Remember Cartimandua, queen of the Brigantes, a client state where there have also been these little uprisings. And rather than protecting Caractacus, Cartimandua hands him over to the Romans. We know that when Caractacus goes to Rome, Claudius pardons him. Now, this is a great, generous gesture. You'll remember that, when Caesar has captured Vercingetorix, he is executed, whereas Claudius, is so merciful and generous that he frees Caractacus, and makes, huge pomp and circumstance about it. However, that doesn't affect the situation in Britain in a positive way. In AD 52, we've got a revolt by the Silures being suppressed, and Ostorius dies. Tacitus says that he's worn out by the continued struggle and resistance. He's replaced by Didius Gallus, and Tacitus is quite negative, quite dismissive of Didius. He tells us that he only held on to our existing conquests, so he didn't try to extend them. We've also got more problems during this period. We've got a civil war in Brigantia between Cartimandua, who's pro-Roman, and Venutius, anti-Roman. And so once again, the Romans have to intervene. The 9th Legion intervenes on behalf of Cartimandua. So this is the second time that there have been problems in Brigantia. Moving on to 54, Claudius dies. He's possibly poisoned, but it's not certain. And Nero becomes emperor. There is a theory that Claudius is poisoned by his wife Agrippina, who is Nero's mother. But Claudius has given the succession to Nero rather than his own son Britannicus. He passes it on to his stepson. Suetonius tells about Nero that he even contemplated withdrawing from Britain. Now, this may refer to after the Iceni revolt, but it could perhaps refer to immediately on his ascension. It's not certain what Roman policy is at this point. Under Claudius, Roman policy was very clear, that the Romans were seemed to be intent on conquering the whole of Britain. They were expanding the Roman province throughout Claudius's reign. And that does seem to continue in Nero's early years. And it does seem to be the Boudiccan revolt that is the turning point. Military tombstones for this time period, from places like Gloucester and Cirencester, suggest a concentration of troops on the Western Front. Do go back to your archaeology booklets that have got those tombstones in of the auxiliary cavalry troops and also of the legionary troops, and make a note of their locations and the rough kind of timescale that they come from, because that gives you a good idea about the Roman progress across Britain. 57 to 58, we get our next governor, Veranius. He has a strong reputation after previous military service, but he only manages to conduct a few raids against the Silures before he dies. His successor, Suetonius Paulinus, began raids against the Ordovices with no reference to the Silures. So this might indicate that Veranius is actually successful in his campaigns, despite Tacitus again being quite dismissive of him. And when Veranius is succeeded in 58, he dies quite suddenly. He's succeeded by Suetonius Paulinus.